Welcome back to Landman Now, podcasting the profession, brought to you by the American Association of Professional Landmen. I'm your host, Chad Smith, and each episode we highlight the people, issues, and opportunities shaping the land profession. Today we're focusing on blowouts and the safety concerns surrounding them. To help me with the conversation, I'm joined by Matt Jones, an attorney with Lisco, a full-service law firm with a focus in the energy sector. In addition to being an attorney, Matt is also the co-host of Energy Law This Week, Lisco's podcast in the oil and gas global network, discussing key legal and regulatory developments in the energy sector. Matt, thanks for joining. And why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself, your background?
Sure, Chad, thanks for having me. First of all, really appreciate the opportunity. So, from a background standpoint, I'm a lawyer, obviously. So, I appreciate your taking time to talk to me, even knowing that. So that's kind of you. So my background is my grandfather was a driller and a tool pusher. My father was a wireline operator, and where I grew up in South Louisiana, I was always within sight of gas flares. So it was almost inevitable that when I went into law, it was going to be in oil and gas. And I've been doing that now for 37 years, I would say. I'd have to do the arithmetic. Obviously, I don't do arithmetic very well because I'm a lawyer, but I've been doing it a long time. I am deeply focused on the energy industry in many, many, many parts of the country. And it's what I've done for a very long time.
Well, very good. And again, thank you for coming on to discuss this with us a little bit.
I appreciate that. And it's good to be able to talk directly to landmen. I deal with landmen all the time. Landmen are awesome. I
Yeah,
mean, I think as we were talking a little bit before we started recording, but one of the great things about landmen is they sort of fill all the gaps in the industry. I mean, they any problem that nobody else has ownership of kind of ends up coming to land at some point or another. So it's great to work with them. The landmen always know what's going on. So if I really want to know what's happening in something, I call the landman
right.
because they're sort of tuned in to every aspect of the operations and the things that are going on. So I appreciate the opportunity to talk to y'all.
Well, very good. So today, we want to talk a little bit about the blowouts and first off, for anybody who's not interested or not all that involved or maybe not all that familiar, what exactly is a blowout and how does it happen?
So the classic example of a blowout is, something like the Deepwater Horizon or something like, I don't know, maybe some of your listeners are old enough to remember John Wayne and the Hellfighters, who was basically playing Red Adair's role there, where you're ending up with basically hydrocarbons pouring out of the surface in an uncontrolled way and a flame. That's what most people think of. It's burning. There's hydrocarbons flowing. You can't stop it. You have to go to extraordinary measures to do it. And that is what we would call a blowout. But more broadly, and this is driven by a number of financial and legal factors, it's called well control or a loss of well control. That's kind of your technical, quasi technical term of art. And that can happen at the surface or it can happen below the surface. So it's important to remember that when you're talking about blowouts, sometimes people will just generally they're referring to the rig burned down. There's a crater in the earth. We have uncontrolled flow. But also you can have underground flow. Some people call them underground blowouts, terms not preferred in the legal industry and certainly not in the insurance industry. But you're talking about a situation where you have lost control of subsurface pressure, either in the subsurface or to the surface. That's generally what you're talking about when you're talking about a blowout.
Okay. And is there a difference between a well blowout and a rig blowout, or are those terms used interchangeably?
Generally they're interchangeable, but it does point up an important thing. You can have a blowout at any stage of the operation.
Okay.
You can have a surface blowout not long after you spudded the well. I mean, you might hit some high pressure water zone and all you got is the diverters on it. You can have a blowout then. You can have a blowout when the well's been producing for 15 years. You can have all sorts of situations arise. So you're really talking about a life of well situation where you're talking about blowouts or loss of well control. And if you're drilling the well, there's going to be a rig on it. And if there's a rig on it, you're going to have what are called blowout preventers. There's these huge things we've all seen. They're big pieces of equipment. They're very heavy. and you use that to close off pressure while you're drilling. And that's a drilling situation. And a lot of blowouts occur during drilling situations. But once you move the rig off, you've got the wellhead on, you've gone beyond it, you're producing, you can still have blowouts. There's a number of blowouts that'll occur in producing wells or during plug and abandonment operations at the back end of the well. So you can have them pretty much at any stage.
Okay. And then therefore the term could change based off of how it's or where you are in that stage.
Pretty much. And generally, again, what we're going to say is, and it's driven mostly by insurance, which we'll talk about, you're going to say it's a loss of well control.
Yeah.
A loss of well control is the general term. So that's generally what you're talking about.
And then how common is it today compared to say 20 or 30 years ago? Have we gotten better at preventing them, or is it something that it's nature and you're still fighting that battle?
So it's hard for me to judge because I only see the wells that blow out. So I mean, I don't see a lot of the wells that are just producing along happily and nothing ever goes wrong, right? Because you don't need me then. So it's hard to say. I think that in the offshore realm, after the Deepwater Horizon, you've seen certainly an increase in regulatory scrutiny. And honestly, from just a capital preservation standpoint, if you're drilling in the deep water, you're going to be extraordinarily careful because the financial consequences are so vast. But that said, I got a call on a blowout yesterday that happened in a land rig during a drilling operation. They happen. Are they more common? It's hard to say. I mean, the technology has changed as far as the way we drill wells now, because most of the capital is going toward horizontals, and they present their own risks. So you're going to have snubbing units out there sometimes in some areas of the country rather than full-on drilling rigs at different stages of completion and things like that. Some of that has changed. I think the types of blowouts you see are a little bit different with horizontal wells than they are with, the true conventional vertical wells that you've seen, or with offshore wells, which are usually, for the most part, straight holes, sometimes directional, but not horizontal. So yeah, I think if you're asking the question of do we have more blowouts today than we used to, or fewer blowouts, hard to say. It is a risk that is inherent in exploration and production, and it's never going to be fully eliminated.
Can you walk us through the moments leading up to what a blowout typically looks like some of the warning signs that maybe get missed, or does sometimes it happen without much warning?
It could be both. Let's take what you would call a standard well control situation. You're drilling along. Let's say you've gotten, I don't know, let's take arbitrary depths. You're at 10,000 feet. You've set your surface casing and you set a liner. Okay, so you're drilling out of the liner. You've got cement in your liner that's supposed to hold back a certain level of pressure. Okay, your crew is tripping pipe in and out of the hole. So one of the things that can happen is as they're pulling pipe out of the hole, the level of fluid should drop in the hole. It's like this is maybe, I don't know if it's a good example or not, but when you get out of the bathtub, or at least somebody as big as me, when you get out of the bathtub, the level of the water drops. Well, you're pulling physical pipe out of the hole, the fluid should drop. If the fluid doesn't drop, there's something pushing back on it, and that's a warning sign. Okay? If you start to pull the pipe and they pull it what's called wet, you pull it, you break it open, more mud's coming out than should, then something's pushing back at you. There's warning signs. There's tanks out there, your mud tanks, and the standard old way they do it is they tie knots in a rope to see the level on the tank. But or pits is what they generally call them. But if your mud pits or your mud tanks, if the level is increasing in those, you're getting more fluid back than you're putting in. That's a warning sign. There's 100 warning signs that you can see. And the rig crews are extremely well trained in recognizing these and deploying the various measures to control the flow at the surface. A lot of things can go wrong with that, but generally speaking, they're going to be on top of it. They're going to train on it. They're going to do what they call pit drills, which is the tool pusher will call out or the driller will call out, say, we got a pit gain, and they are supposed to immediately react and do things like trip the TIW valve and things like that, depending on the type of rig you're using, if you're using a top drive or an old Kelly, They're going to prepare everything. And then again, everything at the surface has been tested probably within the last week or 10 days or so to control the kind of pressures you expect to get, but you never know. So yes, there are warning signs. The rig crews are thoroughly trained to address them. Um, Most times they can control them when they get what's called a kick or a flow of some sort that they don't expect, and there's ways to deal with it. But there's all sorts of variations on that.
Okay. Well, so I mean, having a good crew that to watch things obviously helps prevent it, but sometimes it's just a lot harder to prevent. I take it.
Uh, so you can't always do it. The more experienced your crew, generally, the more they're going to have seen. If you have a crew, for example, that's drilled this same area for the last 3 years, or in some cases like 15 or 20 years, I've seen that. They know. Okay, when we get to 8,620 feet, there's that little gas zone there that's going to kick us. Let's get ready for that, guys. So I mean, your crew's gonna sometimes really know the area. They're gonna know their rig. And what you hear from the crews all the time is you listen to the well. That's what they're going to tell you. We listen to the well. We're watching it. We're listening. We're watching fluid levels. We're watching different things. We're reacting in real time to it. And on the more sophisticated wells, you have incredible telemetry and detailed information on flow in, flow out, all those kind of things. So they're watching those things pretty closely.
Well, okay, so when a blowout does happen, what's the immediate response? Who's making decisions and how fast do things have to move?
Fast. That's the first thing is things move fast. And probably the one of the first things you're going to do is you're going to get with your regulatory people or you're going to deal with your regulatory stuff. You got to tell people about it. So whatever your governing oil and gas agency is, the Railroad Commission or one of those agencies, depends on where you are, you
Right.
need to notify immediately. You're probably going to have lost different types of fluid, maybe oil on the ground or condensate or different things. There's certain environmental laws that are going to apply where you have almost immediate responses that you have to make. I joke because I'm from Louisiana that notification after a blowout is like voting in Louisiana. You do it early and often. Okay, so you just get on the notifications. So that's the first thing is make sure you've required, that your regulatory folks are engaged. If your regulatory person is on vacation or can't be located or, whatever, or maybe you're a smaller operator, you don't have one, get on it. Find somebody who can tell you who you need to notify and get on the notifications. That's crucial. And then from the next stage, you want to be dealing with probably, and this is not necessarily in any particular order, you want to be dealing with your insurance. So you want to get with your broker, whether your broker is like Alliant or one of the big brokers that you're using for your well control insurance. You want to let them know so they can let the market know. And generally, your insurance is going to be in the London market typically. They notify the market. The market needs to know. Get an immediate response or immediate notification to your insurers.
As an attorney, what does the legal aftermath of this look like? Like, what is the fallout from a legal standpoint?
So there's so many aspects of it. So you're going to have the first thing is if the rig is destroyed, you're going to have a claim probably from the rig company for the replacement of their rig. And if not them, their insurer, because if their insurer pays off, they're going to subrogate against you. So you're going to have a claim from whoever your drilling rig company is. And typically speaking, under your standard drilling contracts, you're probably going to be responsible. It depends. You may or may not, but you want to look at that. But you're going to have some liability there. Your landowner responsibility, landmen, you want to get on that, get ahead of that. If you have sprayed drilling mud or salt water or, a piece of equipment or a piece of pipe onto somebody's land or it's damaged their home or it's damaged the paint on their vehicle, get on that immediately. You want to resolve those claims quickly. And here's kind of a pro tip. If you're resolving a claim with a landowner, be sure that you include their insurer on it. So if, let's say you damage their truck, paint's damaged on their truck. All right, they're going to go immediately to their insurer and say, hey, pay me for this damage under my comprehensive. The insurer is going to have a claim against you. So you want to deal with all of that at once.
Right.
Either get ahead of that. That's really, really important to get the landowners straightened out.
So when you look at like historical blowouts. Deepwater Horizon being the most obvious example.
Mhm.
Um, what are the most common root causes of like some of those, the really big blowouts? Is it
So
kind of what we talked about earlier? Is it just the same pressure issues, or is there something else stemming from that?
it's always pressure. So as you go deeper in the earth, the pressure increases. The pressure is the deeper you go, the higher the pressure.
Yeah.
And that can be salt water, it can be oil, it can be gas, it can be condensate, it can be a mixture of those things. And when you're drilling, you use drilling mud to hold that back. It's always somehow the pressure has overcome the controls on that pressure. Whether it's the drilling mud's too light, the blowout preventer didn't close correctly, the shear didn't work. Sometimes you have to have the pipe lined up right for certain blowout preventers to close correctly. They call it lining out or spacing out, all those kind of things. There's a lot of things that can go wrong, and there's a lot of ways it can occur. It's always, though, pressure. When you are drilling, you are dealing with pressure. And when you deal with pressure, you have to control it. If you lose control of the pressure, you're going to have a blowout.
And talking about losing control of pressure, uh, what role does human error play versus an equipment failure? Is one typically more to blame than the other, or is that
It can be a mixture of things. Sometimes this just happens so fast that there's not much they can do. I had a case where they were drilling it like pretty shallow, like maybe 3,200 feet, pretty shallow. They hit a gas pocket. It came at them really, really fast. And the crew had where they were putting the thing on the top that closes off the drill pipe called the TIW, and they had cooked one thread. If they had gotten it another turn, they would have controlled it. But it hit them so fast, it blew that off, and they simply couldn't do it. They reacted, they saw it, they just couldn't react quite fast enough. Um, there's a million things that can happen that will cause this. And remember, and as I mentioned at the beginning, blowouts aren't always necessarily at the surface. So you can have a situation where you have open hole, you hit a high pressure zone, and it's basically coming up the open hole and exiting out of the open hole at a weak zone, a frac point. It's where the pore pressure, technical terms are, the pore pressure has overcome the fracture gradient. And then you'll have flow, you'll have subsurface flow, which will generally be covered by your well control insurance. You just have to recognize that it's occurred.
yeah? So kind of talking about the subsurface blowouts, is there certain types of formations or drilling environments where it's significantly higher?
Yes. What you and it's generally it's known. So generally, you're not wildcatting a lot of wells these days. There's a few, but for the most part, particularly now that you're drilling horizontals, they're sort of known areas that you're doing. Out in West Texas, for example, you're going to have certain zones that are pressured up by saltwater disposal that you know. Like, let's say, I don't know, Delaware Mountain Group is called this zone that they're injecting a lot of salt water into. So you know that if they've been injecting salt water down there for so many years, that when you drill through it, you might have slightly higher pressures than the last well that went through saw. It just depends on where you are. So yeah, there's generally sort of known things that can occur, but then there's always the unexpected. And anytime you're drilling a well or anytime you're operating a well, there's always something that's going to go wrong that nobody expects or nobody sees, or these sequence of events. So there's always that risk out there.
So when you do have a blowout, what happens to the lease or the title? Especially, I mean, we talked about damaging, property owners, but what about neighboring wells?
Very interesting question. So you could have situations where you are, particularly a subsurface blowout, where you're pressuring up a zone that makes it more difficult to drill areas around you. You can have that. In most cases, that's going to be in your unit or your pool, or you're going to own the rights, or you don't often have those kind of claims. You will have those sometimes lost production claims. Let's say I'm an operator and the well has blown out because of a blowout preventer failure. I may have a claim against that manufacturer that includes lost or deferred production. So we have those kind of claims. And then remember that in most cases, and this is where Landman are going to, again, be very, very important. Oftentimes you're going to have joint interest owners out there. You're going to have working interest owners that you have to deal with. And this is a really important part in post blowout. So when you get a blowout, your plans have changed. It's going to be expensive. It's going to hit somebody's budget. That the production that you expected from this well isn't going to be coming on anytime soon. And you may be dealing with working interest owners under your JOA that are not people you originally dealt with. You might have bought into this prospect, so you're dealing with people you don't really know that well. And when these things occur, sometimes people get very upset. So I think in the front end, one of the things I always tell landmen is if you got a blowout, go talk to your working interest owners. Don't start sending nasty emails to each other. Don't do a Zoom call where everybody's screaming at each other and you're recording it, because ultimately that's going to hurt you. It does no good for anyone. If you're a landman, get with your counterpart at your non-op working interest owners. Look, we had this blowout. We're working on it. We want to sit down. We want to talk. We want to talk through the response. We want to talk through what it's going to be. We want to talk through coordinating insurance claims, because oftentimes, the operator has its insurance and the non-ops have their own insurance for well control. We want to coordinate these claims. Let's get together, but let's line this out in a very methodical way. I've seen too many cases where nasty emails start flying back and forth, and it's not a good situation. Generally, the operator under the JOA is going to be protected for the most part, except for gross negligence under the exculpatory clause. So if you're a non-op, throwing these kind of accusations at your operator probably ain't going to help you. If you're an operator, you don't want these non-ops saying, oh, you screwed this all up, when you might have a third-party claim, or you are going to have almost certainly an insurance claim. You just don't want that out there. So landman, get on top of your working interest owners, all the interest owners, quickly, and get everybody lined up on it.
Yeah, can you tell us a little bit more about maybe some of the provisions that are put into these contracts on the front end that speak to blowouts?
Yeah, so generally speaking, your JOA is going to be your major document that controls the working interest owners. And if it's going to be covered, a blowout of any kind is probably going to be covered under Article 5 as far as liability, which basically says in most JOAs that the operator is not going to be responsible for operational things that go wrong absent gross negligence. Now, we occasionally see gross negligence claims during blowouts. Typically speaking, you see them with working interest owners and operators who have a history of friction or are competitive in some way, but they can happen. But the other thing that can happen occasionally is your working interest owner said they got 30% and they have their own insurance. Well, that insurer pays off under the well control policy, and then from time to time it has happened that insurer will subrogate, stand in the shoes of the insured, and then sue the operator. So generally speaking, the big thing that's going to control is Article 5 of the JOA as far as relations between operators and non-operators. The other contractual provisions that are going to apply are going to be in your drilling contract if you're drilling. It's generally, I think, 14 in the IADC. There's going to be a series of provisions that discuss who's responsible for what under certain circumstances. And generally, there's specific provisions covering cratering, which sometimes happens during a blowout, on the sound location clause. And then there'll be provisions concerning destruction of property and things during a blowout. It's also going to discuss, probably under your drilling contract, your drilling contractor is going to be limited in liability as far as lost production or lost resources, generally speaking. And the other big contractual thing is your well control insurance. It's specific insurance that deals with a loss of well control. And typically it's going to cover surface blowouts, underground blowouts, and I'm using those terms very generally. There's defined terms in these policies. It's going to cover pollution that results from your blowout, and it may cover, often will recover the redrilling or restoration of the well to the condition that existed before the blowout. So those are sort of your big contractual things that are going on. Of course, you're going to be responsible under your lease for land damage,
Yeah.
and those kind of things. But
That's
that's the big contractual things you're looking at.
I was going to ask about surface owners or mineral rights holders. Are they kind of taken care of in that provisions, or do you see a lot of the surface owners, mineral rights holders filing lawsuits after a blowout?
So if you talk about, it's different between surface and mineral.
Yeah,
So
yeah. I
if
mean,
you got a surface blowout, you're going to have surface damage. That you're always going to have a claim.
yeah,
And from the landman perspective, the key to that is get with the landowners. Look, we have insurance. Our well control insurance covers pollution. That policy is going to take a while to process through. Be patient with us. At the same time, you're going to be working with the regulators, whatever regulator it is, in terms of the standard for the cleanup that you're going to have to do at the surface. And the regulator, in part, in general terms, is going to be driven by landowner complaints. So if the landowner says, no, you have to clean up every molecule of it, the regulator is going to probably be more rigorous in what they're going to require than if you make peace with the landowner and come up with a more reasonable cleanup plan. So again, this is you're integrating all these different interest owners and trying to coordinate them on a reasonable plan. As far as mineral owners are concerned, there have been claims where a mineral owner has said, hey, you blew this well out. I would have made this much in royalty. Therefore, you should pay me. Or there's also claims that are kind of similar where you have a premature water intrusion where they say it has to do with your not completing the well properly or things like that. There's a variety of claims that could be made. That's state by state. It's going to depend on the law in the particular state about what your exposure there is going to be. In an ideal world, though, you have surface and mineral combined, so you're dealing with one person or one group of people, and you can deal with them. But you're right to point out that you could have claims from both.
and again, I bring this one up because I think it's probably the most known case with Deepwater Horizon. But have blowout related cases changed in the courts since then?
So, yes and no. I think you have seen more sensitivity, of course, after the Deepwater Horizon to pollution and to damage claims arising from that. As far as your basic blowout case, in general, I haven't seen much of a change. I mean, people understand that oil and gas drilling is risky. This is a risk. If you're taking reasonable measures and doing the things you're supposed to do to protect against the risk, I haven't necessarily sensed this incredible hostility towards oil companies in general during blowout cases. But I think you could find some of it there. I guarantee you, when you go to a jury and you ask them if they've heard of the Deepwater Horizon, they all have. And if you have a blowout case, particularly if it's just property damage, one of the first things you're going to do is say, this is not the Deepwater Horizon. Nobody got killed in our case. This is totally, for example, my claim against the insurance company for costs. This is all it is. So you're going to try to distinguish those cases for sure. Was another part of your question that I was going to answer that I've forgotten.
Oh, just about the way that the courts have treated the cases following that, and did that kind of set. But one thing that you had mentioned there that I did want to expand upon was when you mentioned the pollution, because there were massive regulatory changes, but I'm wondering how meaningful those changes were, and have they made a difference?
Certainly offshore. I mean, if you're talking about deepwater wells, yes. And just again, from the industry standpoint, that was a multi-billion dollar loss. And it invited a lot more regulatory scrutiny. It cost BP an enormous amount of money. So people noticed that. And I think that certainly made very clear what the risks are of blowouts and certain types of blowouts. I think that you are seeing, to some degree, sensitivity to where you're drilling in terms of blowout risk. If you're drilling with oil-based mud in a marsh, you've got more risk as far as environmental contamination than if you're drilling with water-based mud out in West Texas. There are certain things that will go into the operational side of it, as far as that is concerned, that will affect it. But let me see what else I had on my list. We talked about that. Let's talk for a moment about, you talked about immediate blowout response, and this is something that I think it's important to think about, and I think Landman can definitely play a role in this. Um, when you get a well control event, you're going to call a contractor like, I don't know, Cud or Wild Well or something like that, somebody who specializes in this. And these are people who specialize in dealing with these situations. You might already have one under contract. You might already have an MSA with them. You might be either encouraged or required to use particular contractors under your well control insurance. But one of the things that's important is evidence preservation. So I have seen circumstances where we come in, 6 months, a year after the blowout, we want to make claims or there's an insurance issue. And I actually had one case where we were looking for this particular stub of pipe, which was important. And one of the in-house lawyers said, "Oh yeah, I'm using that as a doorstop." So we had it there. So be clear from a landman standpoint. Be very sensitive to evidence preservation. In other words, they're going to be pulling metal off this well, and most of the big contractors are going to be sensitive to that. But make sure that your engineers and your folks are engaged, knowing this is what's going on. We need to tag this. We need to make sure we know where it came from. We need to preserve it for purposes of any future claims we might have, either against us or against somebody else. So I think that's another way that landman can definitely be important.
Yeah, and you mentioned a little earlier, the different agencies. I think in Texas, it's the Texas Railroad Commission, if I'm not mistaken, that's who's gonna come out and do the investigation as far as being that regulatory body for that.
Yes, sometimes the land office can be involved depending on where the lands are. There could be different ones, but generally it's going to be Texas Railroad Commission. Sometimes the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality will be involved depending on what the situation is, but Railroad Commission is probably going to be your primary contact and your primary agency.
And from what you've seen, um, I mean, I know that different states have different offices that manage that, but um, are some states are they more difficult as far as working? I mean, I'm sure I know the answer to this already, but are being more difficult to work with, or are going to require a lot more investigation versus others?
Yes, but it depends a little bit on the state and the circumstances. So, how much oil and gas exploration is going on in that state, which state it is. Colorado may be different from New Mexico, may be different from Texas, may be different from Louisiana, may be different from Oklahoma. And part of that may depend upon what the particular agency is interested in or what their kind of their hot button issue at that particular moment is. So if the agency is very concerned about groundwater preservation and no groundwater contamination, that's one thing. If the agency is more concerned about other aspects of the deal, then there can be many of those. That's another. It's going to be agency by agency, and it can vary depending on who within the agency you're dealing with at any particular moment.
Right.
So you really want kind of local expertise and good relationships with the agencies. And again, one of the best ways to keep good relationships with the agencies is just to inform them immediately, keep them informed, open-ended. Look, if you need anything, here's my phone number. You call me. I will get you whatever information you need. So that's the best way to kind of keep good relations with the agencies, which is important.
What is one thing that you wish more people knew about, or the industry or the public knew about, understanding blowouts and how they get misrepresented?
So the first thing is, I think that people assume that there's a blowout, that means somebody did something wrong, or somebody screwed something up, or something broke. And that's not always true. Insurance for the well control insurance acknowledges pretty much that if you've used reasonable measures to contain it, they can still happen. That's why you buy insurance. It's the same thing of, I may get in an accident through no fault of my own. That can happen. And things just happen. I can have a hailstorm come and damage my car. That's why I bought insurance for that.
Right.
Things can occur even though you're doing everything right. So don't assume it just because you have a blowout, something went wrong. So that's I guess the first thing. The other thing is, and I wanted to mention this earlier. Um, I guess everybody on listening to this podcast or watching, if we're watching it, can raise their hand and say they probably saw the first episode of Landman. So, where Tommy Lee Jones was Tom, no, not Tommy Lee Jones, Billy Bob Thornton. I'm sorry. Let me try that again. Billy Bob Thornton goes out there in his F-350. He pulls a wrench and a cheater bar out there, and he turns the valve the wrong way to close it, by the way. And everybody noticed that. First of all, landmen aren't going to be doing that, typically speaking.
Right.
Secondly, you're probably not going to shut this thing down by closing a valve. If you can, the crew would have already done it. And third, you don't close the valve by turning it that way. So don't pay any attention. I love Landman. Okay, some of my cases have been discussed in Landman. Okay, my actual cases. So I love that show, but don't look at that as the actual way blowouts occur or how they're responded to. So that would be definitely a big public misperception. And I think every landman I talked to, certainly every engineer or well control person I talked to, was laughing about that particular episode.
Yeah, yeah. Well, they definitely take creative liberties in that show.
No,
But
no doubt.
overall it's fun to watch. So
But there is always risk. I mean, you're dealing with high pressure, you're dealing with potentially corrosive things. Salt water's corrosive, hydrogen sulfide's corrosive, carbon dioxide, which is coming up, is corrosive. You're dealing with corrosive things. You're dealing with a lot of infrastructure. You're dealing with, like I said, very high pressures, very difficult conditions, and there's only so much you can do to control it. There will be times where you lose primary control. It's why you have insurance, typically speaking. That's why you are, it's just an acknowledged risk in the industry.
so if you were talking to a young landman or petroleum engineer who's just starting out, what's the most important thing you would want them to know about the risk management when it comes to blowouts?
So the first thing is that be ready for them if it occurs. So, generally speaking, if you're not drilling a lot of wells, if you don't have a lot of active drilling rigs, you're not going to have a lot of blowout risk. You can have some during P&A operations. You can have some in producing wells. It can happen. But typically speaking, you're going to want to focus on your drilling wells. How many drilling rigs do we have running? And then what's my landowner situation out there? Where do I have an aggressive, motivated, large landowner who's been difficult to deal with? Because if I have a blowout in one of those situations, you're probably dealing with their lawyer almost immediately. So you want to be alert to the personalities of your landowners and the ownership that you have. Is it surface owner, as you pointed out earlier, minerals? If it's surface, they're bearing all the burden and they're getting none of the benefit for the most part. That's been sold. It's going to somebody else. You're going to want to be sure that you are coordinating your team to make sure that engineering is talking to regulatory, is talking to risk management, is talking to finance. You just want to be there and understand the roles of each one of those. Because regulatory may be thinking that risk management called the broker and vice versa.
Right.
Just be there to ask the questions. Hey, have we, and just ask questions. Hey, are we sure that we've talked to everybody we need to talk to? Are all the insurers alerted? All those kind of things. Is the broker engaged? Have we engaged with the landowners? Have we told our working interest owners? Have we set a meeting to try to deal with them? Those kind of immediate response things, just be sure you're there to fill the gaps and sort of coordinate the team. I think that's the most important thing you can do. And the way you're going to be able to do that is you need to understand what everybody else does. You need to understand what the engineering is doing. You need to understand what regulatory is doing, what risk management is doing, what finance is doing, all those kind of, what legal is doing for those kind of things. And then, of course, if you're dealing with legal, you want to be careful in how you communicate with legal and who's communicating with legal in terms of preserving attorney-client privilege and those kinds of things.
And are there any more resources or organizations that you would recommend for people if they want to learn more about this topic outside of this?
Well, it depends on which way you want to go on it. There's several technical journals out there. The International Association of Drilling Contractors puts out a drilling manual that discusses well control. There's different well control seminars. They put on certifications of drill crews to make sure that they're certified in well control response. But for the most part, I think what you want to do, which is I would recommend to any professional in the industry, is learn your company, learn your industry, learn your business, and understand how it works. Because the more you understand about how it actually works, when you get a crisis like this, you're going to be more useful and you're going to be more helpful to your organization and to the ultimate goal of let's get this resolved behind us and get back to producing oil and gas, which is how we make money.
Yeah, there you go. Well, Matt, that was all the questions I had. Was there anything that we didn't cover in my questions that you wanted to make sure we talked about?
No, that's it. Thank you so much, and I appreciate your interest in this. And
Yeah.
I must tell you because I think you probably have a number of University of Texas fans, and I just want to tell you up front that I'm an LSU guy, and we look forward to hosting you all this fall in Baton Rouge.
Well, there you
Uh,
go. All the Longhorns and Tigers that are listening. I'm sure they're ready for it.
Sounds good. Well, listen, thanks so much for the time to talk to you, and really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you again for coming on informing everybody.
Sounds good.
Well, that wraps up this episode of Landman Now, podcasting the profession. Thanks for listening, and again, a big thank you to Matt for sharing his time and insights. If you enjoyed today's conversation, be sure to subscribe so you don't miss future episodes. You can also learn more about AEPL, our resources, and our membership opportunities by visiting landman.org. And if you're a fan of podcasts, make sure and check out Matt's podcast, Energy Law This Week. And until next time, I'm Chad Smith, and this has been Landman Now, podcasting the profession.